I ran my hands over the diving gear one more time, checking each connection like I'd done 1,000 times before. The straps felt right. Regulator hissed clean when I tested it, everything where it should be, but my stomach still twisted. The meridian cut through water that couldn't make up its mind. Gray-green swells rolling under us, white caps breaking against the bow. October, in the North Sea. Should have been used to it by now. 3 years I'd been working with the Norwegian Maritime Authority. Marine archaeology, mostly shipwrecks from the war, sometimes older stuff, fishing boats that went down in storms, cargo vessels that hit mines. I'd mapped hull fragments and cataloged artifacts until the work became routine. This wasn't routine. I adjusted my weight belt and watched Dawn Arnold bent over her charts at the navigation table. She'd been hunched there since we left Bergen 4 hours ago, making notes in that precise handwriting of hers. Every few minutes she'd glance at the GPS coordinates, then back to whatever she was writing. "You gonna tell us what we're looking for?" I called over the engine noise. She looked up, pushed those wire-rimmed glasses higher on her nose. "Significant historical find." That's what the preliminary sonar indicated. Same answer she'd given yesterday when I asked. Same answer she'd given this morning when Daryl asked. Daryl Hart finished securing the dive platform and walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. Safety coordinator for our little operation. Good man. We'd been diving together since I started this job, and I trusted him to get me back to the surface in one piece. "Pre-dive jitters?" he said, watching me fidget with my gear. Something like that. But it wasn't jitters. Not exactly. I'd felt nervous before plenty of dives. Deep ones, cold ones. Dives where the visibility was so bad you couldn't see your own fins. This was different. Like walking into a room where someone just stopped talking. The diesel engine rumbled beneath us, mixing with the slap of waves against the hull. Salt spray caught the wind and stung my face. 40 nautical miles from shore and the water was already deep enough to hide things. Dark enough too. I'd grown up around boats. My father fished these waters for 30 years before his back gave out. Taught me to read the sea, respect it, never turn my back on it. He used to say the ocean keeps its secrets for a reason. Maybe that's what bothered me. Dawn's secrecy felt wrong, like forcing open something that wanted to stay closed. "How deep are we talking?" Daryl asked, checking his dive watch. Dawn consulted her charts again. 120 meters, maybe 130. Technical diving depth. Not dangerous if you knew what you were doing, but deep enough to require decompression stops. Long enough underwater to get into real trouble if something went wrong. I pulled on my dry suit, feeling the familiar weight of the material. Neoprene and sealed seams built for these cold waters. The suit would keep me alive down there, but it couldn't shake this feeling that we were heading toward something we shouldn't disturb. "University sonar picked this up last month," Dawn said, finally offering more information. "Anomalous reading on the seafloor. Size and shape suggest a vessel, but the configuration doesn't match any known shipwreck in this area." "Unknown shipwreck?" I said. "In waters this well-traveled?" She nodded, but something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. Academic types, always holding back details until they could publish their papers and claim credit. The engine pitch changed. Captain Erickson was slowing us down, probably checking GPS coordinates against Dawn's marks. I'd worked with Erickson before, solid guy who knew these waters better than most. If he was being careful, there was good reason. I walked to the stern and looked out at the water. Gray horizon meeting gray sky, no land visible in any direction. The kind of emptiness that made you feel small. Made you remember that humans weren't meant to spend this much time on the open ocean. But something else was out there. Something that had been hidden under these waves for who knew how long. The wind carried diesel fumes and salt, sharp and clean. My dry suit crinkled when I moved. Synthetic fabric over insulation layers. Standard gear for cold water diving. But it felt heavier today. Like the weight of whatever was waiting below was already pressing down on me. "Coordinates confirmed," Captain Erickson called from the wheelhouse. "Dropping anchor." The engine died, leaving just the sound of waves and wind. Sudden quiet that made the emptiness feel bigger. Daryl started setting up the dive platform while I finished my gear check. Mask, fins, computer, backup regulator, everything in its place. Routine movements that should have been comforting. They weren't. Dawn powered up the sonar unit, adjusting controls until the screen flickered to life. Green sweep rotating, painting depth readings and seafloor contours. Normal stuff at first. Flat bottom, scattered debris. Typical North Sea floor. Then the reading changed. I moved closer to the screen, watching the sonar paint something that didn't make sense. The object was big, maybe 60 meters long, but the shape was wrong. Not the broken hull of a wartime wreck or the scattered remains of a merchant vessel. This thing was intact. "How long has it been down there?" I asked. Dawn stared at the screen, her face pale in the green glow. "That's what we need to find out." But her voice carried something else, not just curiosity, fear. The sonar completed another sweep, painting the same impossible image. Whatever was down there had been sitting on the seafloor, untouched and undiscovered, until last month's survey found it. A ship that shouldn't exist, in perfect condition, in waters that should have been picked clean decades ago. I looked at the depth reading, 128 meters. Deep enough to hide anything, dark enough to keep secrets. And we were about to go down and disturb whatever had been sleeping there. "Jaden, you seeing this?" Arnold's voice cut through my concentration. I looked up from the console. She was bent over the sonar station, her face lit by the monitor's harsh light. That expression, I'd seen it before, when we'd found the merchant vessel off Stavanger. Pure excitement barely held in check. "Yeah, I'm seeing it." I wiped salt spray from my eyes. "What am I looking at exactly?" She straightened up, pointing at the screen. "Preliminary scans are showing a German U-boat, World War II vintage." Her finger traced the outline on the display. U-427 if the hull markings are accurate. The name hit me wrong. I'd studied enough maritime records to know the significant losses. That boat vanished without a trace in 1943. Exactly. Arnold's grin was infectious. Should have been infectious anyway. "Look at this structure integrity reading." I moved closer to the screen. The submarine sat there in digital green, every detail crisp and defined. No battle damage visible from the surface scans. No structural collapse from 7 decades of crushing pressure and corrosive seawater. It looked like someone had driven it down there yesterday and parked it. "There's no way." I started, then stopped myself. In this business, you learned not to say impossible too quickly, but this pushed every boundary I knew. Arnold was already pulling up historical records on her tablet. U-427 departed Kiel in March 1943. Last radio contact was somewhere in these waters. She gestured toward the horizon. Then nothing. Complete disappearance. Hart appeared at my shoulder, already suited up in his safety gear. "Water temperature's reading weird down there." "Weird how?" "Several degrees warmer around the hull than the surrounding ocean." He frowned at his instruments. "And the electromagnetic readings are all over the place. Equipment's acting like there's some kind of interference." I felt my stomach tighten. Equipment didn't lie, but it didn't usually tell stories this strange either. "How warm are we talking?" 8 degrees Celsius above ambient. Hart tapped his gauge. Consistent reading across multiple sensors. 8 degrees. In deep water that should be uniformly cold, that kind of temperature variation meant energy. Heat source. Something active down there. I started pulling on my deep water gear, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar routine. Wetsuit first, thick neoprene that would keep hypothermia at bay in the crushing cold below. The material felt heavier than usual, or maybe that was just my nerves. "Safety protocols," Hart announced, shifting into his coordinator voice. "Maximum bottom time is 25 minutes at 200 feet. Decompression stops at 150 feet. Emergency ascent procedures." His words blended into background noise while I focused on my equipment check. Regulator hissed properly when I tested it. Air gauge showed full tanks. Depth computer powered up clean, displaying surface readings in bright blue digits. But something felt off about the gear itself. The regulator's hiss carried a strange resonance, like an echo that shouldn't be there. The depth computer's display flickered once, twice, then stabilized. "You getting anomalous readings on your equipment?" I asked Hart. He glanced at his own gear. "Little bit. Nothing that'd scrub the dive, but..." He shrugged. "Could be interference from whatever's causing those electromagnetic spikes." I strapped on my dive computer, watching the numbers dance across its face. Depth, 0 meters. Time, 14:37. Temperature, surface reading normal. Then the display glitched. For just a second, the depth reading showed 43 meters. Impossible since I was standing on deck in open air. The number flickered back to 0, but I'd seen it clearly. Hart. Yeah? Equipment check one more time. Everything. He nodded, understanding the tone. When gear started acting strange, you didn't take chances. Not at 200 feet. Not with an anomaly sitting on the bottom that shouldn't exist. I tested my regulator again. The hiss sounded normal this time, but my depth gauge flickered once more. 43 meters. Then back to 0. 43 meters. The exact depth where U-427 had last reported its position in 1943. The descent took 8 minutes through water that grew darker with each meter. I watched my depth gauge mark our progress into the abyss, the bright blue numbers climbing steadily. 30 meters, 50, 75. The water around us shifted from blue to green to gray, then finally to black. Even with our powerful dive lights cutting through the murk, visibility dropped to maybe 15 feet in any direction. Hart swam beside me, his light beam sweeping left and right in methodical patterns. 100 meters. The pressure squeezed against my wetsuit, compressing the neoprene until it felt like a second skin. My breathing echoed in the regulator, steady and controlled despite the adrenaline building in my chest. At 150 meters, Hart's light caught something, a shadow in the water below us, too regular and defined to be natural sea floor. The electromagnetic interference was getting stronger too. My dive computer flickered more frequently now, showing random depth readings that made no sense. 180 meters. The shadow began to take shape. 190 meters. I could make out the distinctive silhouette of a submarine's conning tower. 200 meters. Hart's powerful dive lights illuminated the hull. My breath caught in my throat. The U-427 sat before us in perfect condition. Gray hull unmarked by 7 decades of submersion. No rust, no marine growth, no signs of age or damage. The submarine looked exactly like it had the day it left port in 1943. It looked like it had submerged yesterday. The hatch seal broke with a soft hiss. I pulled myself through the opening and into the submarine's interior, expecting to feel that familiar resistance of water rushing past my mask. Instead, my movements felt wrong, too easy, like swimming through air that happened to be wet. Hart squeezed through behind me, his breathing apparatus creating steady bubbles that rose and disappeared into darkness above us. I clicked on my diving light and swept it down the main corridor. My beam hit polished metal walls, not corroded metal, not the green-black patina I'd seen on every wreck from here to the North Sea. Polished. The bulkheads gleamed like someone had run a cloth over them that morning. Brass fittings caught my light and threw it back without a trace of tarnish. I'd been diving wrecks for 15 years. Metal didn't stay bright underwater. Not for 80 years. Not for 80 days. Jesus, Hart's voice crackled through the comm. Look at this place. The corridor stretched ahead of us, perfectly preserved. Pipes ran along the ceiling in neat parallel lines. Valve wheels sat in their housings like they'd been installed yesterday. Everything mounted exactly where it belonged, nothing shifted or torn loose by decades of current and pressure. I kicked forward, running my light along the walls. Emergency lighting fixtures dotted the passageway every 10 feet or so. As we moved deeper, one of them flickered, then another. Pale yellow light pulsed through the water in stuttering intervals, casting our shadows against the opposite bulkhead in jagged, dancing shapes. The shadows moved wrong. I stopped swimming and held position, watching the interplay of my diving light and the submarine's emergency system. The shadows should have followed our movements exactly. Basic physics. But these shadows seemed to lag behind us, then rush to catch up when we changed direction. "You seeing this lighting?" I asked Hart. "Yeah. Must be some kind of chemical reaction. Phosphorescence, maybe." Hart always had explanations. Usually they made sense. This time his voice carried that particular tone he used when he didn't believe his own words. We reached the first major intersection. Control room to the right, crew quarters forward, engineering aft. I turned toward the control room and immediately understood why this wreck felt so unsettling. Everything looked ready for use. The periscope housing stood in the center of the compartment, its bronze fittings bright and clean. Navigation charts lay spread across the plotting table, held in place by metal rulers and compass tools. Depth gauges lined the forward bulkhead in perfect rows, their needles pointing to readings that made no sense for a submarine sitting on the seabed. I swam closer to the instrument panel. The depth gauge read 60 meters. We were at 128 meters. The pressure gauge showed normal atmospheric readings. The electrical systems panel had switches positioned in the active configuration, like the crew had stepped away for a coffee break. Hart moved to a desk bolted against the starboard bulkhead. "Jaden, over here." He was examining a leather-bound logbook, its pages somehow dry despite being underwater for 8 decades. The binding showed no signs of water damage, no swelling, no discoloration. Hart opened the cover carefully, and the pages turned with the crisp sound of fresh paper. "How is that possible?" I asked. "Don't know, but look at this." Hart held the logbook so I could read the entries. The handwriting was clear and precise, written in blue ink that hadn't faded or run. Dates progressed normally through September and into October of 1943. Routine patrol reports, weather observations, navigation updates. Then the entries changed. October 10th. Strange sonar contacts below us, massive signatures moving at impossible depths. Chief sonar operator reports sounds he cannot identify. October 12th. Lost contact with Fleet Command. Radio equipment functioning normally but receiving no transmissions. Position confirmed, but somehow we are alone in empty ocean. October 14th. Crew reporting unusual dreams, always the same images. Something vast rising from ocean floor, always watching us from below. I read the final entry twice. October 15th. Contact established with entity of enormous size moving beneath vessel. Sonar indicates structure larger than any known submarine or surface ship. Attempting communication protocols. All hands report sensation of being observed. Something is coming up from the deep. Something is... The entry stopped mid-sentence. No other pages had writing on them. "That's it," Hart said. "Nothing after that date." I stared at the logbook, my mind trying to process what I'd read. Military submarines kept meticulous records. Captains didn't stop writing log entries unless something prevented them from continuing. Something final. "We need to see the rest of the boat," I said. Hart nodded and closed the logbook carefully, tucking it into his gear bag. We left the control room and continued deeper into the submarine. The emergency lighting followed our progress, flickering on in sections as we approached and dimming behind us as we moved away, like the boat was waking up room by room. The torpedo room lay at the forward end of the submarine. I'd explored dozens of torpedo rooms on wrecks across the Atlantic. They always looked the same. Empty weapon racks, scattered equipment, sometimes unexploded ordnance that required careful handling, but always empty of people. This torpedo room wasn't empty. 24 men sat at their stations. They wore German naval uniforms that looked freshly pressed. No decomposition, no skeleton remains. Complete human figures with waxy, pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in our diving lights. Their eyes were open, staring straight ahead with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. Every single one of them looked like he'd seen something so horrifying that his mind had simply stopped functioning. I floated in the doorway, unable to move forward. My breathing apparatus felt suddenly inadequate. The recycled air tasted metallic and wrong. "This isn't possible," Hart whispered. But there they were, sitting exactly where they'd been when something had happened to them 80 years ago, preserved perfectly in this impossible underwater environment that followed no rules I understood. I forced myself to swim closer to the nearest figure, a young sailor, maybe 20 years old, his hands gripping the edges of his workstation so tightly that his knuckles showed white beneath translucent skin. His mouth was slightly open, like he'd been in the middle of screaming when everything stopped. I needed to check for signs of life. Professional obligation. Even though nothing about this situation made sense, I had to follow proper procedure. I reached out toward the sailor's neck, looking for a pulse point. The moment my gloved fingers made contact with his skin, his head turned toward me. Not slowly, not naturally, with a mechanical clicking sound like gears engaging. His neck rotated 45 degrees in a single movement, bringing his terrified eyes into direct alignment with mine. Black water mixed with oil poured from his mouth in a steady stream. His lips didn't move. His expression didn't change. Just that horrible mechanical turning motion and the dark fluid spilling out like he was a broken machine leaking its contents. I jerked my hand back and kicked away from him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sailor's head remained turned toward me, tracking my movement with those wide, terrified eyes, while black liquid continued flowing from his mouth into the surrounding water. All around us, the preserved crew members started shifting, not like they were waking up, nothing that natural. Their movements came in jerks, like marionettes with tangled strings. One by one, they lifted their heads, turned toward us with those same wide, terrified eyes I'd seen on the first sailor. But their hands, Christ, their hands moved with purpose. I watched a gunner's mate reach for the breech of a torpedo tube, his fingers finding the manual release like he'd operated it yesterday. Another crew member, Chief Petty Officer by his stripes, grabbed a wrench from a tool rack, testing its weight with practiced ease. They all moved in unison, perfect coordination without a single word spoken between them. Hart's breathing accelerated through his regulator. The sound cut sharp through the water around us. Too fast, too shallow, panic breathing. I'd heard it before on dives when someone's nerve broke. "We need to go," I said through my comm. "Now." Hart's hand clamped around my upper arm, pulling me toward the corridor we'd entered through. His grip bit deep enough that I'd have bruises later, if there was a later. We kicked hard toward the exit, but something felt wrong about the water. Too thick, too resistant, like swimming through syrup instead of seawater. I reached the corridor first and slammed face first into solid metal, a bulkhead. Where the passage to the surface should have been, steel plate stretched from floor to ceiling, welded joints, no seams, like it had always been there. "What the hell?" Hart's voice crackled through the comm. I ran my hands along the metal, searching for any gap or opening. Nothing. The corridor we'd swum through minutes ago had vanished, replaced by submarine hull as solid as the day it was built. Hart spun around, checking the other passages. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to make my chest ache. Every exit we'd noted on our way in, sealed. Every corridor, dead ends into bulkheads that hadn't existed before. The hatch we'd entered through. I kicked toward it, desperate now, knowing what I'd find but needing to see it anyway. Closed. Locked tight. The wheel that had opened so easily now refused to budge when I threw my full weight against it. We were trapped. Emergency lighting flickered to life throughout the submarine. Red strobes painted everything in hellish shadows, and the steady thrum of electrical systems filled the water around us. Systems that should have been dead for 70 years. That's when I felt it. The subtle shift in pressure against my eardrums. The kind of change you learn to recognize after years of deep diving. We were rising. My depth gauge confirmed it. 120 meters. 115. The numbers dropped steadily as the submarine ascended from the seabed with us inside. "The sub's moving," Hart said. Unnecessary words. I could feel it in my bones, that queasy sensation of rapid ascent, like riding an elevator that's climbing too fast. Around us, the preserved crew worked with mechanical efficiency, no wasted motion, no hesitation. They operated controls and checked instruments like they'd never stopped being sailors, like the 70 years underwater had been nothing more than an extended watch. A torpedo man cycled through his pre-firing checklist, fingers dancing over controls that glowed green in the emergency lighting. Another crew member powered up targeting systems, radar screens flickering to life with sweeps of electronic light. Weapons systems. They were preparing weapons systems that should have been scrap metal and corrosion. 100 meters. 90. 85. The submarine climbed through the water column with purpose, its engines thrumming beneath our feet. I could feel the vibration through my diving gear, through my bones. Powerful engines. Fully operational engines in a submarine that had been sitting on the ocean floor since the war. 70 meters. 60. 50. We were going to surface. A German U-boat from 1943 was about to breach with a full crew of preserved sailors and working weapon systems, and we were trapped inside. 40 meters, 30, 20. The pressure change hit my sinuses like a sledgehammer. Too fast. Way too fast for safe ascent, but my body didn't seem to be suffering the effects of rapid decompression. The water around us maintained its density, its resistance, like we existed in some pocket of ocean that followed different rules. 10 meters. 5. The submarine breached with the sound of a mountain falling into the sea. Water cascaded from the hull in torrents, thundering against the ocean surface as the vessel rose fully from the depths. Through the hull, I could hear waves crashing against steel plating, the submarine rocking as it found its equilibrium on the surface. Emergency lighting shifted to normal illumination. White light flooded the submarine's interior, revealing details I hadn't noticed in the red strobes. Everything clean, everything maintained. Brass fittings polished bright, steel surfaces free of rust, gauges and instruments reading normal operational parameters. I found a periscope station and pressed my face to the eyepiece, desperate to understand what was happening above the waterline. The Meridian sat maybe 2 nautical miles off our starboard bow. Even through the periscope's limited field of view, I could see the research vessel's crew scrambling across her decks, tiny figures pointing in our direction. Someone, probably Dawn, standing at the bow with binoculars raised. They'd be trying to radio us, trying to understand how a submarine had just materialized from the depths in the middle of their dive operation. I adjusted the periscope's magnification, bringing the Meridian into sharper focus. Dawn stood at the communications console, probably cycling through emergency frequencies. The rest of her crew clustered around equipment, their body language screaming confusion and alarm. Around me, the German crew continued their preparations with the same eerie efficiency: loading procedures, target acquisition, systems checks on equipment that should have been inoperative decades ago. They were preparing for battle. The realization hit me like ice water in the veins. We hadn't just discovered a preserved submarine. We'd awakened something that had been waiting on the ocean floor, maintaining its readiness, preserving its crew and its mission, something that had been meant to stay buried. Hart appeared beside me, his face pale behind his diving mask. "Jaden." His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Pure terror. "The reactor," he said. "The bloody reactor's powering up." I followed him aft, toward the engineering section. Radiation warning lights pulsed amber along the bulkheads, and the Geiger counter on Hart's equipment belt clicked with increasing frequency. The reactor compartment glowed with operational lighting. Gauges showed normal pressure, normal temperature, normal everything. Control rods positioned for full power output. A nuclear reactor that had been cold for 70 years was climbing toward critical mass, with us trapped inside. The manual flood valve fought me every inch of the way. My hands shook against the wheel. Whether from the cold or the terror, I couldn't tell anymore. The thing hadn't been turned in 70 years, and it showed. Rust flaked off under my gloves as I threw my full weight against it. Behind me, Hart kept watch on the crew members who'd started their jerky, unnatural movements. "Come on," I muttered through my regulator, the words coming out as bubbles. "Come on, you piece of—" The wheel gave. Just a quarter turn, but enough. Water started trickling through the valve housing. Not much at first, a thin stream that mixed with the black liquid still pooling around the torpedo tubes. But I could hear it gaining pressure behind the bulkhead. The ocean wanted in, always had. I was just giving it permission. I spun the wheel harder, more water. The trickle became a flow. Hart tapped my shoulder, pointed back toward the crew compartment. The preserved sailors weren't just moving anymore. They were turning, all of them, heads swiveling in our direction with that same mechanical precision they'd shown when they first started stirring. Their eyes weren't confused or disoriented. They were angry. The flow from the valve became a stream. Proper seawater now, not the strange preserved medium that had kept this place suspended between life and death. Real ocean water, cold and salty and alive with microscopic organisms that belonged to our world, not theirs. That's when I understood what we were seeing. The preservation wasn't just breaking down, it was being attacked. The fresh seawater was like acid to whatever force had kept these men suspended for 7 decades. Their skin started changing color, losing that waxy perfection. Patches of normal decay appeared, spreading outward from where the new water touched them, and they knew it was our fault. The first one reached for us just as the stream became a torrent. I'd flooded compartments before during emergency drills, but never while standing inside one. The water hit the deck plating with enough force to knock me sideways. Hart grabbed my tank harness, steadied me as I fought to keep the valve turning. Almost there. Almost. The sailor's hand closed around my ankle. His grip felt wrong. Not like flesh and bone, but like something trying to remember how to be flesh and bone. His fingers dug in through my wetsuit, finding pressure points that sent shooting pain up my leg. I kicked. My fin caught him square in the chest, and he flew backward further than any human should have. But he didn't let go. His arms stretched, elongated, keeping that impossible grip while his body tumbled away. Hart! I couldn't see my partner through the chaos of rising water and reaching hands. The compartment was filling fast now, the pressure differential sucking seawater through the valve like it was trying to swallow the ocean. More hands grabbed at me. These sailors moved like they were underwater even before the flooding started. Slow, deliberate motions that covered more distance than they should have. One caught my air hose, another wrapped fingers around my mask strap. I stopped trying to be gentle with them. These weren't people anymore. Maybe they had been once, 70 years ago when the U-427 had first submerged, but whatever had preserved them had also changed them into something else, something that belonged to the submarine's impossible existence. I drove my elbow backward, felt it connect with something that gave too easily, spun around and shoved hard against a chest that felt hollow beneath my palms. The sailor stumbled back, but his face showed no pain, just that burning rage at what we were doing to their sanctuary. Hart appeared beside me, kicking furiously at a crew member who'd wrapped both arms around his legs. "The hatch!" he shouted, the words barely audible through his regulator. "Get to the hatch!" The conning tower ladder was maybe 20 feet away, might as well have been 20 miles. Water kept pouring in, reaching our waists now. The submarine's lights flickered as electrical systems started shorting out. In the intermittent darkness, the preserved crew members looked even more wrong, their movements too fluid, their eyes too bright. I grabbed Hart's arm and started pulling him toward the ladder. We moved like we were swimming through honey, fighting against the current and the grasping hands and our own equipment that suddenly felt too heavy, too cumbersome. A sailor blocked our path to the conning tower. This one looked different from the others, older, with more rank insignia on his deteriorating uniform. The captain, maybe. He stood perfectly still while water swirled around his legs, watching us with an expression I couldn't read. Then he smiled. Black liquid poured from between his teeth like oil from a cracked engine. But he didn't reach for us. Just stood there, smiling that terrible smile while his crew members closed in from both sides. I understood. He wanted us to know this was personal. Through him, I told Hart. Only way. We hit the captain together, shoulder to shoulder like we were breaking down a door. He felt solid enough when we connected, but the impact sent him flying backward in that same impossible way. His body hit the bulkhead with a wet sound, then slid down into the rising water. The ladder. Finally. I grabbed the rungs and started climbing, Hart right behind me. Below us, the torpedo compartment was almost completely flooded now. The preserved crew members moved slower as the water rose over their heads, but they didn't stop moving. They stood on the deck, looking up at us through the dark water with those bright, angry eyes. The submarine shuddered. Not from the flooding. That felt different. This was deeper, more fundamental, like the whole boat was coming apart from the inside. "The reactor," Hart said as we reached the conning tower hatch. "It's going critical." I could feel it too, a vibration in the metal that spoke of chain reactions and runaway fission. The submarine was dying, and it was taking us with it. The hatch wheel turned easily under my hands. Too easily. For 70 years, that wheel had been locked solid by pressure and time and whatever force had preserved this place. Now it spun like it had been oiled yesterday. The submarine wanted us gone. I pushed the hatch open and cold ocean rushed in to meet us. Real ocean this time, not the preserved medium that had kept the U-427 suspended between worlds. The pressure difference sucked us upward like we'd been shot from a cannon. Hart went first, his fins disappearing through the opening. I followed, pulling myself through just as the submarine lurched sideways. Something was happening to its ballast systems. The whole boat was losing stability. We cleared the conning tower and started swimming hard for the surface. Behind us, the submarine's hull groaned like a living thing in pain. Emergency lights flickered along its length, casting wild shadows across the seafloor before going dark one by one. My depth gauge spun backward, 120 meters. 115. The numbers dropped faster than they should have, even with us swimming full out. The submarine was falling away beneath us, taking its impossible crew back down to where they belonged. At 90 meters, I looked back. The U-427 was already disappearing into the darkness below. Its lights were gone now, all of them, leaving just a black shape against an even blacker void. But I could still feel it somehow, that sense of wrongness, of something that shouldn't exist finally accepting its fate. A stream of bubbles rose from where the submarine had been. Not air bubbles from a sinking vessel, but something else. Something that sparkled with its own light before dissolving into the surrounding water. The last of whatever had preserved that place was finally letting go. My lungs started burning at 60 meters. We'd been down too long, breathed too much compressed air under stress. Nitrogen narcosis made everything feel dreamlike, but I knew the danger was real. Had to slow down. Had to decompress properly, or we'd end up with the bends. But I also knew we didn't have time for a proper ascent. At 40 meters, Hart grabbed my arm and pointed up. I followed his gaze and saw the Meridian's hull silhouetted against the surface light. Dawn would be watching our air gauges, timing our dive, probably starting to worry about how long we'd been down. She had no idea what we'd found, what we'd had to do. At 20 meters, the pressure started easing enough for my head to clear. The narcosis faded, replaced by the simple exhaustion of staying alive when everything wanted you dead. My air gauge showed red, maybe 10 minutes left if I controlled my breathing. Hart's showed even less. We broke the surface together, gasping as our regulators cleared the waterline. The ocean felt impossibly bright after the darkness of the submarine. Clean, normal, like the world I remembered before we descended into that nightmare. The Meridian sat maybe 200 yards away, her engines idling to maintain position. I could see Dawn on the dive platform, binoculars raised in our direction. Behind us, nothing. The water where the submarine had been showed no trace of disturbance. No debris field, no oil slick, no bubbles, just empty ocean stretching to the horizon. If I hadn't lived through the last hour, I'd never believe anything had been down there at all. Hart pulled his regulator from his mouth, treaded water beside me. "You think anyone's going to believe this?" I floated on my back, letting my breathing settle while I watched clouds drift across the sky. Normal clouds, normal sky, everything exactly as it should be. "No," I said, "and that's probably for the best." The last bubbles from the U-427's descent finally reached the surface, tiny sparkles of light that popped and vanished the moment they touched the air. Then even those were gone. I started swimming toward the Meridian, Hart beside me. Behind us, the ocean kept its newest secret, just like it had kept all the others. Some discoveries were meant to stay lost. Some doors weren't meant to be opened. The submarine was back where it belonged now, in the depths, with its crew, carrying whatever force had preserved them down to places where it couldn't touch our world anymore. I hoped it would stay there.